I've seen a department that had such a great relationship with their instrument manufacturer sales rep that he would come in and inventory their backup wall for them, tell them what's missing, and, get permission to put together a sales order for those instruments. Now, that's a lot of labor on the side of that rep, but he saw the value in that partnership, and I imagine that partnership's going to stay that way for a long time.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
On this week's episode of Beyond Clean, I speak with Bobby Parker, clinical manager here at Beyond Clean. And the title of this week's episode is Backup Terry 2.0, the explosive power of backup inventory data. This is a conversation that if you've ever struggled with missing instruments or ever had complaints in the operating room from incorrect instruments in your trays, if you go to your backup instrument wall and it's a disaster, this episode is for you. We're going to talk about a lot of best practices and insights for how to fix it and how to fix it in a way that you can maintain the progress and enjoy the glory of being able to find replacement instruments. So hang with us here. Put it in reverse, Terry. We'll be back with you in a moment with Bobby Parker.
I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Balch.
From 17 Studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
And join us on this episode of Beyond Clean is Bobby Parker. Bobby, welcome to the show today.
What's up, Hank? Good to talk with you again.
I know you're coming off of a high. You just had a fantastic presentation at the HSPA conference down in San Antonio. Got a lot of kudos and shout outs from the crowd. Before we get into this topic, tell the folks who may have missed that presentation what it was that you talked about at the conference.
Yeah, sure. That was a lot of fun. And shout out to HSPA for letting me have the stage for a bit to present on that. So I talked about something I'm personally very passionate about, and that's process-driven error prevention. So it was a workshop in the pre-conference where we walked through a bunch of different common errors that you find in sterile processing departments and what strategies as leaders can we use to try to limit those and limit the severity of the outcome of those types of errors. So it was a lot of fun. We had some laughs.
On this episode, you're going to be wrapping up our season 16, Yes We Scan. So we're going to be talking about maybe some errors, but errors related very specifically to instrument data, and even more specifically than that to instrument data as it pertains to backup instruments or extras or the wall, as they call it in some places. So I'm really looking forward to getting into that topic today. And I guess as we set the stage, can you talk about what kind of the status quo is around these instruments and around these extra instruments, or I guess maybe specifically the missing instrument challenge in our sterile processing departments?
Sure. Yeah. And I guess just to clarify what we're talking about with these backup instruments, these are your unsterile instruments that you have that you would grab if you are missing one from a tray. And I've had the benefit of working in several sterile processing departments here in Louisville, but also through my work with Beyond Clean and just other visits, I've been in a lot of sterile processing departments. And as you talk about the status quo, I'll tell you, not too many departments have a good organization system for those backup instruments. And all the departments that I've worked in have way too many backup instruments. beds. You talk about the backup wall. We had a wall in one of the departments with yellow plastic bins, and we just called it the yellow monster because it was gigantic, right? And the challenge that you alluded to when talking about missing instruments is whenever you've got that huge wall of instruments and it's not well organized, inevitably you're going to end up with a lot of trays that have down instruments because you can't find what you need.
And in particular to this conversation today, you've got all these instruments, but that's not necessarily reflected anywhere in the data in your tracking system oftentimes. So can you talk about that impact of that status quo? Because you've got these, even if it is organized, let's just assume, for the sake of conversation, that you do have a great backup wall and everything's where it should be. But if it's not tied in any technological way with your tracking system, there could still be an impact into the operating room and into the patient. So what, in your experience, again, kind of going through this process, what are some of those gaps and challenges from the physical layout into the data piece?
Yeah. I think the helpful umbrella to park all this underneath is my general hatred of institutional knowledge. And what I mean by that, what I want to say by that is the things in your department that Susie knows about because she's worked here for 20 years, but nobody else in the department who's only been here for 1 to 6 months knows. And backup walls, organization projects that aren't tied to data tend to be those types of things. So you have a new tech who comes in the department, the backup wall is well organized, but when they're missing something, they're not exactly sure where to find it. They have to go read a bunch of labels. They do eventually find it. It's a different manufacturer than the one they're looking for. And the only way they can figure that out is go to Susie and say, hey, does this belong in this tray? Is this an okay substitute? And if she says, yeah, go for it, you're just trusting Susie and putting it in there. And so the more that we can build into our processes, into our data, tools to equip technicians to have the knowledge at hand instead of depending upon that institutional knowledge, it's going to save them a lot of time. It's going to help them do their job better, maybe prevent some errors along the way. So as you talk about things that we could do, like what are the gaps in the data, I think going beyond just organizing things, putting your pickups together, your needle holders together, alphabetizing it, we got to find a way to get that data into our count sheets, into our tracking systems, into the hands of our technicians who are just rolling out on the floor. And I guess I could give you some examples of what that would look like if you're interested.
Well, I do want to know some specific examples, but I want to go back actually to something at the beginning that I probably should have asked at first. But in terms of the impact, like we just kind of ran into this and assumed, that missing instruments are bad. And I think everybody listening to the show is going to understand that. But can you explain what that impact is or what the impacts are to the customer, not only in the operating room, but sometimes in the clinics and the ER? Like, what does it mean to have a missing instrument in your tray?
Yeah. So we've got count sheets that'll have a recipe of what belongs in that tray, right? And if we're missing something that we deem as not mission critical to that tray, we'll put it up and write on the count sheet or print out on the count sheet that it's missing something. And what I found as a sterile processing manager is that my customers were under enough pressure and stress in the OR that they did not read those count sheets. And so even though it said what was missing on the tray on the outside of it, it was always a surprise to them. They discovered on the back table that it wasn't. And I remember having several conversations over something was missing and you didn't tell us. And it turns out it was on the count sheet. They just didn't read it. But nonetheless, in terms of impact to them, those count sheets are designed the way they are for a reason. They want all of those items in there. And so we shouldn't have 10, 15% of our inventory missing bits and pieces and having to pull around those and try to invent ways around those. We want them focused on patient care and on taking care of that patient and not trying to come up with substitutes on the fly because their favorite needle holder's missing.
Yeah. So speaking of substitutes, that's something else that you brought up on one of your previous answers. It's not just a problem of is the item missing, is if it's incorrectly substituted by something else from either a new technician or maybe an experienced technician that just got tired of looking for half an hour for that particular model number. And they said, well, well, this is the only scissor on this whole freaking wall. And I know they want a scissor in here. And so instead of marking it missing, I'm going to give them a scissor. And then as it turns out, they're not happy with that either, right?
Yeah, it definitely takes a lot of work on the front end to figure out what those acceptable substitutes are. And I guess if you're starting at ground zero, it's going to be a while before you can build all that in. But yeah, that's an important tool to give your techs, is what's going to work as a substitute and what's not, so they're not guessing.
And we'll talk about how to do that with data here in a moment. But I want folks who are kind of listening to this episode and thinking, okay, yeah, I've got this backup inventory. I've never really thought about how do I connect it to my tracking system in any helpful way. And if you've never really dug into trying to organize a backup inventory in a manner that can be linked to data, it's a very complex challenge. And it goes into even what you said earlier, like let's just talk about scissors. Well, how many different models of scissors and variations do you have in an average sterile processing department? And then in the answer to that question, how many different bins or peg holes do you need for all of those variations? We're talking curved and straight. We're talking sharp and blunt. We're talking long and short and medium. Like all of that adds up to variation. It's not as easy as, hey, that's the scissor bin, and that's where all the extra scissors are. So go check it out, right?
Yeah, I remember we were trying to solve that problem with our needle holders. We had way too many varieties, and we're trying to get our arms around what we had. And so we committed to just, let's make a separate bin for every variety we had. I think we ended up with like 14 to 17 different needle holder bins. No, it wasn't needle holders. It was right angles, something that you would expect you'd only have 5 or 6 of. We had 14 to 16 bins worth of right angles that were all so similar. And once we spread all that out and blew it out, then we could go through the process of trying to get teams together and choosing which few patterns we're going to have, because we were not going to keep backups for 16 different kinds of right angles.
So what prompted original, because you've been through the process, right? Which is why we're talking to you about this topic. But what was that like, that spark or that catalyst that pushed you over to edge to say, I'm going to dedicate the time and the resources and the stress to actually get this problem fixed?
Yeah. Well, really the only two that I can think of are the ones we've already talked about. The first is the impact to the customer of those missing trays. So one of the things we did is made trays incomplete or trays missing instruments as one of our department KPIs. We reported it out during the daily safety huddle at the hospital. We tracked data on it, and we wanted to get down to under a certain number of trays anywhere in our inventory that was missing any instruments. And at the start of this project, the state of that number was really bad before it was being reported, right? And then the other one is just looking for efficiencies and the way in which we could save time for our technicians if they knew where to find things. And I'll tell you, this one project had some pretty dramatic impacts on both of those.
That KPI piece, I think, is a very important point. And I'd like you to talk about how you found the courage or the craziness to promote that big number outside of your department, because I think that's kind of a pride issue, honestly, for a lot of departments, is we don't want to advertise how broken any of our processes are, but especially something like this, when you're talking about hundreds, if not thousands of missing instruments out of this inventory that is our responsibility as department leaders and even as frontline technicians. So, like, how did you feel safe in your job, I guess, to say, hey, I'm going to wave this flag and I'm going to tell everyone every day how many we have missing?
Well, let me give credit to the people to whom it's due. I've always worked behind and under some very courageous leaders. And so every department that I've worked in, it's been a part of the culture that sterile processing gets a voice and is going to speak up when they see an issue. And so the administration, the ORs that I've always worked with have been very accustomed to that. And so, the first guy through the wall is the one who loses the most teeth. I wasn't the first guy through the wall, right? So there's that. The other thing that I would say is we need to be willing to be transparent in sterile processing about what's really going on, particularly if you're a new leader, because if you post the data and it's terrible, nobody assumes it's your fault, right? You're just saying, maybe if you've been there for 5 years, I don't know, but I'm just joking. I think anytime we can post transparent data that shows the real state of what's going on in the department is useful, because that gives you a baseline. And then you can show on that line graph where you started some new processes. And even though you may not be able to prove what one thing started moving the KPIs in the right direction, you can certainly see the dips coming whenever you're adding new things, like, we're 20% of the way through organizing the backup wall. We're 80% of the way through, and see it driving down that missing number.
On that KPI piece, because it's such an important part of this conversation, I know what it captures. It tells you how many trays a technician has marked an instrument missing in. What does that KPI not tell you that you still need to know about the process? If I'm asking that, I don't know if I'm asking that correctly.
Yeah. I think what you're digging at is those aren't going to be your only trays in inventory that are missing something. And so you'll still get reports back from the OR of, incomplete trays that weren't marked missing, wrong substitutions. We just lumped all those under the category of contents didn't match the count sheet. And of all the errors that we tracked in our department, that was the number one error, as contents didn't match the count sheet, which was maddening because it is the one thing that we have the most control over, right? Putting the things in the tray that the list calls for. It just goes to show you, I guess, how difficult the job can be in terms of moving that much volume through a sterile processing technician's table and keeping track of all the different manufacturers, all the different acceptable substitutions. It can be tough. And so that just keeping track of how many are marked as missing doesn't necessarily mean that all of your trays are excellent and complete.
Yeah, but it's a good starting point.
That's right.
Right. And to start getting into then some of the how to part of this process, right? You even alluded to the example of the right angles and all the variations that you walked in to that. I'm sitting back here thinking about the scope of a traditional inventory again, and just like if you got 14 variations of right angles, like how many different variations of these scissors and these pickups and these clamps and these retractors and on and on and on and on. Like, where do you even start without getting completely overwhelmed, like yourself and your team?
Yeah. Anytime you're doing a data project that has to do with inventory, you got to start with figuring out what you got, which is why I was talking about those 14 bins of right angles. We just wanted to know what we had, because before that, there were 2 bins. There were short right angles and long right angles, and each one had, 8 different varieties of instruments in it. So you got to figure out what you have, and whether you have the space to make a bin for each of those or not. Maybe you have to think of another way to organize them, in drawers or something to be able to lay out what you have. And then I think from there, once you know what you have, and you need to start going to your coordinators, your OR specialists to figure out which pattern of right angles we're going to be using. I think tackling the whole inventory and carving out a week on the OR schedule just to clean up our data is probably not the most useful way to do it. What I found is creating rhythms within meetings that are already taking place to review trays. And so each of the service lines had a service line meeting that happened quarterly, which isn't very frequently, but we just asked for 5 to 10 minutes of that meeting to bring one tray from their service line to go over it when all their techs and nurses were going to be together talking about it. And it's in those meetings that you can talk about, hey, we have a 6 1/4 inch right angle and our standard one is 7 inches. Can we move to the 7 inch right angle and get this excess out of inventory just to start consolidating some of those patterns and find out if they really care about that extra 3/4 inch.
Now, Bobby, that sounds like tray optimization more than backup inventory organization. So what's the connection there? Like, why did you go through that process?
Yeah, it was motivated by optimization because we wanted to try to take some instruments out of those trays that weren't being used, right? But where that helps
that
you with
way,
your
I
backup
guess,
wall.
Yeah, like you don't need an extra if you're going to take it out. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then also if you've got, 14 different, slightly different right angles, you can maybe pare it down to 6 or 7 if the ones that are only in one tray, they're okay with using the more common one.
And so you get buy-in then from these service line leaders, from these OR nurses to standardize and optimize these trays. That reduces the total number of variations on your backup wall. But then on just the practical, like how to organize and then how to link that organization into your tracking system, how did you approach that and what did you find successful?
Yep. So the most successful piece of it was linking it into the tracking system. So what we did is try our best to get a bin or a spot or a pegboard slot for each individual pattern. There were some things that were, not very common that all kind of lumped together into one bin, but generally we tried to get each pattern in its own bin, stuck a label on that and organized it just like you would a sterile inventory or something like that. This is, rack A. It's got the scissors and needle holders on it, but down to the bin level, this is bin 302 that has the 7-inch curved Mayo scissors in it. And then in our tracking system, we put into the master inventory of instruments for all the manufacturers of 7-inch curved Mayo scissors we had that it lives in unsterile bin A302. That way, on our count sheets, when our technicians are going through there, it says right next to the instrument while they're assembling the tray that if they need another one of these, go walk over to 302. That's where they're kept. And that really cuts down on the amount of time that technicians spend searching for things. And it also helps limit the number of accidental mistakes you have where people put the wrong scissor in there because it tells you exactly where to go. So that was the most impactful in terms of helping our technicians. In terms of how you organize it, there's lots of ways to organize a pantry, right? Do you put the quick grab items on the most convenient shelf? Do you do them alphabetically? Do you do them by shape and size? There's lots of ways you could do it. But generally what we found is organize them by type, like scissors together, needle holders together, and so on. And then within that type, do them alphabetically so that if somebody didn't have that bin number on hand, I guess they could go to the scissors section and find what they're looking for.
Yeah, you kind of answered my next question, which is if you're doing a bin system that's tied to a unique instrument, is it even important to have it organized in any other way? Because you're just going from the count sheet to the bin, and what does it matter if it's in the middle of a lot of clamps as long as it's the right instrument? But to your point, if you're not coming from a count sheet, for whatever reason, and you're looking for all the scissor variations, I guess that would make sense to have them clumped together. Yeah,
I can't have been in the only department where this happened, but if somebody had an extra instrument that we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. We'll say they didn't put it away because their shift ended and they forgot about it, but you find these rogue instruments laying around the department come Monday morning when there's not a lot of things going on in the department. You got to figure out where to put them and you don't have the count sheet in front of you. So having kind of an intuitive organization is helpful for getting that stuff put away.
If you build it into the master inventory, as you mentioned, then hypothetically, a technician could pull it out of an extra bin or off a table, then look up that product number and then be able to see which bin it should go into. Is that the way that model should function?
Absolutely, yeah. And we gave that job to trainees whenever we were really busy and didn't have somebody to be their preceptor. If they were, only a week in prep and pack, we would give them a basket of instruments that needed to be slotted back on the backup wall, because at least it's given them practice of typing it into the inventory system and it tells them the name and where it lives on the backup wall. So you just get a little bit of reinforcement repetition with name recognition on that.
And it actually ends up in the right place as opposed to doing that with trainees, like teaching them, but not necessarily knowing if they're going to get it right. You mentioned the impact of this organization and link into the tracking system on efficiency. Were there any other impacts to the team or to the customer in capturing the chaos of your backup inventory?
Yeah, I don't have it on paper anywhere, but I'll tell you, one of the things that I always paid attention to is the feedback we got from travelers. These are experienced technicians who go all over the country for sterile processing departments, and oftentimes they end up in departments that are, they're on fire. They need a lot of help and they don't get a lot of training. And so whenever travelers would come to the department and say, this is one of the most well-organized departments, like, can I please extend here? I love working here. Like, it's so easy. Like that tells you a lot about, the air that your technicians are breathing on a day-to-day basis if they're not constantly being frustrated with fighting with processes that should be easy. And they know it should be easy, but it's just not. So yeah, I think organizing your department and having a backup inventory and a data set that is clean and workable and makes sense definitely makes people's lives a lot easier, and it's more fun to be at work.
And I would assume it gets to repair the trust in your inventory. I know as a technician, you begin to distrust your backup inventory if you know it's constantly a mess and it's constantly not there. And so you're like, why am I going to interrupt my groove for 30 minutes to go dig around for something that's not going to be there anyways? And so I'm just going to do the easy thing and I'm going to mark it missing. Like you said, I know I'm not the only technician who has done that before, right? But to our defense, in my credit, right, it's because the process was so broken and I had lost so much trust in that backup inventory that I just decided to protect myself and the efficiency and stop going there. But if you can repair it and build that confidence that if you hit pause on this tray assembly and you go to this bin number, chances are very, very high that the correct instrument is going to be there and that you're going to be back processing within 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And the challenge on us as leaders then is just making sure that they're in there. You can, as we talked about in this season, fall into an overdependence on data. And so you get technicians that say, whatever's in bin 302, I'm pulling it out of there and putting it in the tray. And so there's still work to be done on making sure stuff gets in the right spot and that ordering is done well and that we don't run out of things in the bins. But that's work that we would need to do anyway. So let's make it easier on our technicians and on our technicians who are ordering, our supervisors who are ordering and restocking those bins.
Is the answer to part of that challenge then instrument level scanning, like with those little, data matrix codes, like with that hardwire that?
It certainly could. One of the things that I like about instrument level scanning is it associates the data set to what you have in your hand, and you can get down to the level of instrument substitution. So if you have all of those acceptable substitutes programmed in and you scan an instrument, even though it's not what's on the count sheet, it will tell you if it has been pre-approved by your, management team or whoever is managing your instrument tracking system, if that is an acceptable substitute for your customers. And so that certainly can help.
On the piece about maintaining this data that you've worked so hard to develop on the instrument backup wall, tied into the count sheet, how would you recommend folks who have made good progress to not go backward over time and through transitions that inevitably happen, like people leave, managers change? What's some good best practice or tips to keep that consistent over time?
Yeah, so as one of our technicians or educators this season mentioned, that this garden needs tending to, right? One of the things that I'm a big proponent of is having one person be responsible for instrument ordering or database management. And so whether that's a department manager or if it's an instrument coordinator or the day shift supervisor, whoever that person's going to be, constraining those inventory items being added to the tracking system to one person, I think is a good thing. It keeps us from having, 3 different 7-inch curve Mayos, but each of them are spelled just a little bit differently. Having one person order the instruments helps us make sure that we know what's in the ordering process, what's on back order, what needs to be put into those bins. So I think that can be a useful way to keep up your data integrity.
I know we are completely scratching the surface of this topic. Like, I feel bad about moving on because there's like hours that we could continue to drill down into the importance of count sheets, the importance of technician integrity. Just like I mentioned earlier, you can build a process, but if your techs don't feel confident in following the process, it's not going to work anyways, even to the point of scanning and identifying when instruments are missing. Because what tends to happen in my experience is you get a tray, instruments not in the tray, then you go to the backup wall and you get another one and you put it in, but then there's zero record that there was ever an instrument that was missing. That's the data gaps there still. But as we wrap up here, I do want to give you the opportunity specific to this topic today. Is there anything else that you maybe haven't done in an instrument backup process that you feel like would take it to that next level to continue to hardwire it into the efficiency of the department?
Yeah, the one you hit on, I think, is a big one, is having some kind of almost like a Pixis-style inventory management of the backup wall that would manage itself so that you didn't have to have that one person responsible for ordering instruments go through and take a par level count on the bins and see that we're running out of Adsons with tissue Adsons and towel clips again because they keep getting thrown away. Just having that be managed by data, that also could help keep record of how many instruments our technicians are having to grab off the backup wall. And that's a whole nother set of data in terms of how we're taking care of our instruments and the time we're spending on it. So I think that would be very helpful in terms of streamlining the ordering process. In terms of other things that I could see would be useful, I think the implementation of computer vision and augmented reality or assisted reality things, glasses that would tell you that you're about to put that instrument in the wrong bin, throw a big X up on it and highlight the one in green. That's kind of thinking into the future here, but I think those types of organizational methods of where computers can help assist you in getting it to the right place would be great. Perhaps one that is more 2 feet on the ground in our day would be having a good consignment process for instruments. A lot of departments do this, but having a consignment locker on hand of instruments that are owned by the manufacturer and the manager has a key to. And if you run out of towel clips, you've got a store of 20 of them in there, so you can just unlock it, take a few out, and at the end of the month, that cabinet gets inventoried by the manufacturer, and you only have to cut one PO for everything that was missing instead of buying something every third day because you need to buy another thing. Related to that, I've seen a department that had such a great relationship with their instrument manufacturer sales rep that he would come in and inventory their backup wall for them, tell them what's missing, and, get permission to put together a sales order for those instruments. Now, that's a lot of labor on the side of that rep, but he saw the value in that partnership. I imagine that partnership's going to stay that way for a long time. So there's a lot of things you can do to try to keep cleaning that up and outside the box ideas for making sure that those bins stay full and have the right instruments in them. One last thing, Hank, I know that we're trying to wrap this thing up, but I want to call this out, even though it's not directly related to data, is how we're managing those backup inventories, because when we've got open air bins with instruments in them, inevitably they end up dusty and gross, and we're telling technicians that these are acceptable substitutes to throw in our trays. So we also have to be thinking about how can we keep these instruments clean, and if we're not keeping them clean, what cleaning process are we going to put them through before they go into those trays? I want to see fewer departments grabbing instruments with dust bunnies on them and sending them straight into the tray in assembly.
I think you got a round of applause from some Joint Commission surveyors out there for that last comment, Bobby. I really appreciate your time today. Great insights. And as I mentioned before, I know we're just scratching the surface. So for folks who want to ask you some more questions potentially from this interview, how do they reach you?
Yeah, you can reach me at bobby@beyondclean.net. That's Bobby with a Y, bobby@beyondclean.net. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And yeah, I would be happy to talk with you about it. This is something that if you could only do one thing as a brand new sterile processing manager to make things easier for your technicians, get fewer errors, make your OR happier, let's organize our inventory, our count sheets, our backup wall, and you will start seeing some improvement in your KPIs for sure.
All right, that's going to do it for this week's show. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or on your favorite podcast application. You can also access bonus content for certain episodes by downloading our smartphone application for iPhone and Android. It's legit. Go check it out. We would certainly appreciate a rating and review because your feedback is important to us and to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future Beyond Clean podcast, just send us an email to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of all of us at Beyond Clean, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and we can't wait to see you again next week.